Nobody knew why the cage was there, left behind in the ruins of an old mining outpost. But when he kicked it open, he didn't expect a girl with a torn dress, sunburned cheeks, and eyes that didn't blink. She didn't cry, didn't ask questions. She just followed him. Only later, when the sheriff rode into town with blood in his eyes and asked who'd taken his daughter, did the cowboy realize the girl he'd saved wasn't just lost. She was a secret meant to stay buried. Under the thick stretch of desert sky, the mining outpost sat in the quiet kind of ruin that had long since stopped surprising anyone. The boards were curled, nails rusted out of their holes. What hadn't been stripped for firewood or scrap had surrendered to the wind years ago. He hadn't come for shelter or trouble, just water. His horse limped, favoring its right foreleg, and the canteen clinked hollow at his side. Dismounting slowly, he let the reins drop and stepped through the warped archway of what once might have been the supply store. It smelled of dust and scorched iron, and beneath it, something older, like dried blood under sun-bleached rock. He moved carefully. Places like this didn't scream, they whispered. A sliver of movement caught the edge of his eye as he passed what was left of the bunkhouse. A glint of metal in the shadows. Not the kind that shines bright like a weapon, but dull and gray with heat and disuse. A cage. It stood behind a leaning post, framed by crumbled stone and a rusted water barrel. Square, iron-barred, and silent. At first, he thought it was empty, another relic of someone's cruelty long past. But then the stillness shifted. Something breathed inside. He stepped closer. Dust lifted beneath his boots in little spirals. Inside the cage, curled against the far corner, was a girl. Thin. Too thin. Her skin was sun-leathered, her dress barely fabric anymore. But she was alive. Her eyes locked onto his with a stillness that didn't flinch. No movement, no voice, not even a whimper. Only that silent, desperate sort of watching that didn't ask for help because it had forgotten how. The lock had already rusted through. He pushed the door with his boot, and it gave a metallic sigh before swinging open. She didn't move. He waited, unsure whether to speak, whether words would even reach her. But slowly, so slowly, she unfolded herself from the corner. Bones shifted under skin like dry reeds under canvas. She stepped out on bare feet and stood beside him. Just like that. No thanks. No tears. Only the wind between them and the sound of the horse snorting behind the ruins. They walked back in silence. He didn't offer a hand, didn't ask questions. The desert didn't give answers easily, and her silence seemed older than the rocks they walked over. When they reached the saddle, he lifted her up gently, not as a rescuer, but as someone who understood the brittle weight of survival. He didn't ride fast. The sun would drop soon, and the canyons ahead would be unforgiving in the dark. She held tight to the horn of the saddle, not to him, not out of fear, but out of instinct. He felt it in the way she didn't lean, didn't tremble. She wasn't broken, just emptied out. They reached a half-collapsed barn by nightfall. He built a fire, not big, just enough for heat. She sat across from it, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes flicking toward the flames but never past them. When he handed her a piece of jerky, she took it slowly, chewed like her body was remembering what food meant. He gave her the blanket last. She didn't thank him, but when she lay down, she pulled it tight, curled around it like it was the first warm thing she'd touched in weeks. He didn't sleep much. The wind rattled through the boards above, and he kept one hand near his rifle. Not because of her, because of the world that had left her in a cage. In the morning, she was awake before him, sitting up, watching the sun paint stripes through the broken slats in the wall. He poured water from the canteen into a tin cup and set it beside her. She drank slowly and then looked at him, not at the fire, not at the door, but at him. A single, focused glance. Not fearful, not thankful, just awake. They rode out again without speaking. The trail back to town wasn't long, but the silence stretched it. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer. Every so often, she looked over her shoulder, as if afraid the cage might be following them. Or maybe the memory of it, or something worse. When they reached the edge of town, the first signs of life returned. The clatter of a blacksmith's hammer, dogs barking in back alleys, the creak of a rocking chair on a shaded porch. And then the eyes, dozens of them, turning toward the rider and the girl behind him. It wasn't until he dismounted in front of the general store that he saw the sheriff, standing still, hand resting not on his gun, but on the brim of his hat. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. And then, in a voice not meant to be heard by anyone else, he said her name. The girl didn't respond. She only climbed down from the horse, moved behind the cowboy, and stood as if the space between them had meaning now. The kind of meaning only cages could give. The sheriff stepped forward slowly, and that was when the cowboy saw it in his eyes. Not joy, not grief, but guilt. The town of Barlow Ridge wasn't large, but it had a way of watching newcomers like they were storms on the horizon. Nothing dramatic, just the slow turn of heads, the shift in shoulders, the way conversations dipped to a murmur when unfamiliar boots touched wooden planks. As the cowboy led the girl past the blacksmith's forge and down the edge of Main Street, the heat from the forge felt like a warning. She stayed just behind him, her steps soft and guarded, as if unsure whether she was meant to follow or flee. The sheriff hadn't moved much since he'd first seen her. His eyes had narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, tracing the outline of her face with something like recognition, sharp but uneasy. He'd taken one step forward, then another, but kept distance like it hurt to get closer. The cowboy had seen that look before. Men wore it when guilt was heavier than grief, when the past reached for their throat instead of their heart. Inside the general store, silence hung heavy. The girl stood near the wall, shoulders brushing crates of flour and nails, while the cowboy spoke in low tones with the clerk. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, scanning each surface, each face, not in curiosity, in calculation, as if measuring the exits, the angles, the weight of every object that could be thrown, blocked, or used to disappear. It wasn't fear that held her, it was habit, a deep-set vigilance that had once been survival and now just lingered like a second skin. When the sheriff finally approached, the cowboy straightened. He didn't put a hand on his gun. He didn't need to. The girl hadn't moved, but her fingers had tightened around the edge of the shelf she stood near. She watched the man who called himself her father with an unreadable expression. No rush of emotion, just the barest flicker of recognition, like looking at a shadow from another life. The sheriff tried to speak again, but his voice cracked before it reached words. He took off his hat, held it in his hands like an apology. Dust clung to the sweatband. His knuckles were white where they gripped the rim. The cowboy stood between them, not as a barrier, not yet, but as a question. Outside, a wind kicked up, blowing grit against the windows. It rattled the sign that hung loose on one hook. People stepped aside, whispering behind palms and coats. The sheriff took a breath and looked the cowboy in the eyes. There was something heavy in the glance, not threat, but burden, as if asking for understanding and expecting none. Later that evening, they sat in the boarding house. The girl hadn't spoken. She'd taken a seat by the window and watched the dust dance in the last orange light of the day. The cowboy stood by the stove, pouring coffee into a cracked enamel cup. He didn't offer it yet. She hadn't asked for anything, but her presence filled the room with the kind of weight that made the walls seem closer, the silence thicker. He thought of the cage again, the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't begged, just stepped out as if stepping into nothing. That kind of quiet came from deep wounds, ones that didn't bleed but never healed. He wondered what kind of world left a child behind in a ruin. What kind of man let her disappear? The sheriff didn't come that night, but his deputy did. Young, with dust on his coat and uncertainty in his stance. He knocked once, twice, then waited. When the cowboy opened the door, The deputy removed his hat, shuffled his feet. He didn't look at the girl, only handed over a letter, folded once, edges torn. No seal, just scrawled words on yellow paper. The sheriff's handwriting. The cowboy read it in silence. No apology, no explanation, just a request. Don't bring her to the jail. Don't bring her to the office. Meet him at the church. Midnight. He burned the letter in the stove after the deputy left. At 11:30, they stepped out into the night. The girl walked beside him now, not behind. Still silent, but her movements steadier. The moon hung low, casting long shadows through the empty streets. The town had gone quiet, as towns do when the truth walks among them. The church sat at the edge of the cemetery, half its shingles missing, bell rusted in its tower. The door creaked as they entered, and the cowboy could already see the sheriff inside, standing by the altar. Not in prayer, just waiting. The girl didn't stop. She moved down the aisle slowly, past the pews, until she stood halfway between both men. Her hands were loose at her sides, her hair catching the moonlight through the broken stained glass. The sheriff's mouth opened again. No words came. The cowboy watched, and the girl, after all the silence, all the distance, finally looked her father in the eyes and shook her head, just once. A single gesture that said everything. The sheriff dropped his hat to the floor, knees bent slightly, as if the weight of that moment threatened to pull him down. But she had already turned away, and the cowboy followed her out into the night. They rode at dawn, leaving behind the crooked spire of the church and the judgmental quiet of Barlow Ridge. The sky was barely tinted with the bruised lavender of early morning when the cowboy saddled his horse, the girl already waiting near the edge of the barn, coat too thin for the chill. She didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't offer a destination. Some journeys weren't about direction. They were about leaving what had to be left behind. The land stretched out before them in muted silence. Fields gone to ash-yellow stubble, fence posts leaning like old men, creeks whispering under a crust of frost. The rhythm of the horse's hooves was steady, a heartbeat on hard earth. The girl rode behind him on the saddle at first, then beside him once the sun cleared the hills and warmed the road enough to soften the cold from her fingers. She didn't smile, didn't speak, but she no longer held herself like she might bolt. That was something. Around midday they reached the burnt-out homestead, a place long lost to time and fire. Charred beams still leaned against each other in the skeleton of what had been a home. He paused there, studying the blackened wood, as if it might give up a name or a warning. The girl stepped down from the horse and walked through the ruin barefoot, toes pressing into the ashes like they remembered where things used to be. A cradle of iron lay half-buried in soot. She knelt beside it, brushed off the flakes with her sleeve, then stood again. There were no tears, just stillness, like she was reading something in the silence. They moved on. By evening, the wind had picked up. It swept across the plains like a voice from nowhere, bending dry grass and stirring dust devils along the trail. The cowboy spotted a ridge up ahead, where the remains of an old telegraph station sagged against the wind. He led the horses there, tied them near a cluster of rocks, and gathered kindling from what was left of a split fence. As the fire took, casting long shadows against the stone, the girl sat down close to the warmth, tucking her knees under her coat. She watched the flames, but her eyes weren't really on the fire. They drifted often toward the hills, as if expecting something or someone to follow. The cowboy knew better than to ask. Sometimes silence carried more truth than questions could ever uncover. Later, when the sky turned indigo and the stars began to scatter like salt, he handed her a piece of dry bread and a tin cup half filled with boiled creek water. She took it without thanks, but with a nod. Her hands no longer trembled when she ate. That was another something. He stayed awake long after she slept. The fire had died to coals, and the wind sang through the broken beams of the old station. Somewhere in the distance, Coyotes called out, their howls thin and lonely. The cowboy sat with his back to the stone, rifle across his lap, eyes half-lidded but alert. This far from town, law meant little, and he had no illusions about the reach of a sheriff who'd once locked his own daughter in a cage. Before dawn, she stirred. Not from dreams, he could tell, but from instinct. She sat up slowly, brushing the hair from her face, eyes scanning the horizon as if listening to some distant thread of danger. He nodded toward her gently, and she lay back down without protest. She trusted him enough not to run. That was everything. When the first light cracked open the sky, they broke camp. No words were exchanged. The path ahead curled into a canyon rimmed with red cliffs and dotted with mesquite. The cowboy had ridden through that pass once before, years ago, when he still believed justice was something that could be delivered like mail or bullets. Now he knew better. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of a small outpost. Not a town. Just 3 cabins, a trough, and a man who sold bullets and beans out of a shuttered window. The cowboy stopped there for supplies, left coin without comment. The girl stayed mounted, back straight, eyes alert. A local woman passed her with a glance, then turned away quickly. The girl didn't react. As they rode out again, the cowboy noticed her glancing toward the mountains. She didn't say it, but he knew. She'd recognized the direction. They were headed toward something she hadn't planned on, something waiting. And somewhere behind them, farther than the eye could see but closer than comfort allowed, rode the sheriff. Not on horseback, not in fury, but in memory, in consequence, in the unresolved weight of a father's shame. And that meant the road ahead was no longer just escape. It was reckoning. They followed the canyon deeper into the belly of the land, where shadows lingered longer and the wind whistled through crevices like a voice trying to remember its own name. The horses' hooves echoed off the stone walls, slow and deliberate, their rhythm swallowed by silence. Above them, vultures drifted in lazy spirals. The girl sat steady in the saddle behind the cowboy, her arms loosely wrapped around his coat, her face unreadable but alert. This part of the country didn't welcome strangers. It watched them. By midday, they reached a dry riverbed. What had once been a wide stream was now cracked earth, scattered with the bones of forgotten animals and the remnants of old campfires. The cowboy dismounted, leading the horse by the reins, scanning the ridge lines with a practiced eye. The girl slid down without a word, landing soft as dust. She moved like someone who had spent years hiding from sound, from light, from people who demanded answers she never had. They rested under a jagged rock overhang, the shade offering brief relief from the sun that pressed down like judgment. The cowboy broke a strip of jerky and handed half to the girl. She took it, chewing slowly, eyes still on the ridge. There was something tighter about her movements now. The air had changed, not with danger but with memory. He could feel it in the way she kept glancing toward a certain bend in the canyon, as if something familiar lay beyond it, or someone. In the late afternoon, they passed an abandoned stagecoach stop, just a sagging porch, 2 broken windows, and a sign that had been burned halfway through. The cowboy paused there, scanning the dust for recent tracks. None. Still, the girl didn't dismount. Her fingers gripped the saddle horn a little too tightly. Her breath shallowed. He watched her eyes, and for a moment, they were the eyes of a child again. Not just wary, afraid. He led the horse forward, not asking, not pressing. Some truths had to walk their own way out of the dark. By dusk, they reached a narrow pass, the mouth of which was marked by 2 crooked trees grown out of stone, twisted like fingers trying to claw free from earth. The cowboy remembered this place. It was a natural gate, hard to cross, easy to defend. He had no map, but he knew this canyon well enough to know what lay ahead. A hidden valley, miles wide and protected by its own silence. Few went in, fewer came out. As they passed between the trees, the girl turned in the saddle, looking behind them. She lingered like she expected the land itself to rise and block the path back. Inside the valley, the air felt cooler. The wind softened. Grasses grew longer here, untamed. There were old trails, nearly invisible, marked by displaced stone and bent shrubs. The cowboy found one and followed it. The horse knew how to read the land, and the cowboy knew how to trust the horse. Together they moved as if they belonged, even if they didn't. They made camp near a small pond just after sundown. The water was low, but clear. The girl knelt at its edge, cupping her hands to drink. Her reflection rippled across the surface, blurred, half-formed. She stared at it for a long time, then reached into her coat and pulled something small from a hidden pocket. A button. Plain, brass, dull with age. She set it on a flat stone beside the pond, then turned away. The cowboy watched her from the fire. He didn't ask. He only noted how gently she had placed it down, as if it carried more weight than a bullet. Later, when the sky bloomed with stars and the fire had settled to quiet amber, the girl finally broke the silence. Not with words, but with movement. She came to sit across from him, knees folded beneath her, her face still, her gaze direct. For the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger or a shield, but as something uncertain, something she might be able to trust. Or not. She reached into her coat again and this time drew out a piece of cloth. Folded, faded. She unfolded it slowly, revealing an embroidered letter at the corner. S. Stitched in red thread. She set it between them on the ground. Her eyes flicked to his, waiting, testing. He studied the cloth, then looked at her. Not a question, not a demand. Just a quiet acknowledgement. He leaned forward, picked up the cloth, folded it carefully, and handed it back to her. She didn't take it. She only looked at it. Then, for the first time since he'd found her, she whispered a name. Not hers. His. It was the name of the sheriff. And it wasn't spoken with love. It was spoken like a wound. Then she stood, turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight, and walked to the edge of camp. And he understood. The journey wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about return. Return to the place where a cage had been built not out of wood or iron, but out of betrayal. And the girl was no longer running from it. She was walking back toward it. The next morning broke without fanfare. Just a pale light nudging through the overcast sky and the steady breath of the land rising with it. The cowboy stirred the fire back to life before the girl awoke, feeding it with dry twigs and quiet movements. The pond reflected little of the sky now, just a dull gray surface, like an eye watching without blinking. Birds didn't sing in this valley. Even nature held its breath here. She rose slowly, her body stiff from sleep, her face unreadable. But something in her posture had shifted. Not just alertness, intent. She drank from the tin cup he offered and stared toward the east, where the pass they'd crossed yesterday now lay hidden behind folds of hills and trees. That wasn't where she was looking, though. Her gaze was locked toward the rise in the distance, a sloping hill topped by what looked like the black bones of a dead tree. The cowboy followed her stare, then nodded. They packed without speaking. By mid-morning, they were climbing a trail no longer used by men. Only animals walked this path now, mountain deer and old coyotes with ribs like fences. The trees here bent low, their branches gnarled by wind and time. Each step forward crunched dry leaves and brittle pine needles. Each breath carried the taste of old wood and long-forgotten smoke. At the top of the ridge, they came upon the remains of a small homestead. Just a stone chimney and the squared outline of what had once been walls. Half buried in grass was the twisted hinge of a door, and beside it, a rusted tin pail with a dent like a bullet had kissed it. The girl dismounted and walked the perimeter. The wind tugged at her coat, but she moved deliberately, as if walking a memory. She knelt near the chimney and brushed away dirt with her hand. Underneath, charred wood gave way to a shape, a circle carved into the foundation stone. Not recent, not decorative, A mark. She stared at it for a long time, then stood and faced the woods. The cowboy hadn't moved. He watched her like one watches the wind, quietly, knowing it can change everything without warning. They didn't speak as they continued on, but a word hung between them now: home. Not the place behind them, not yet the place ahead, but something she carried, something he guarded. As the sun passed its peak, they descended toward a wide clearing. It was a forgotten place, untouched and silent. At the far end of the clearing stood a cabin. Unlike the ruins they had passed, this one was whole. Not lived in, but not dead either. The roof sagged slightly, the porch steps were cracked, but the structure remained. As if someone had built it for waiting. The girl stopped 10 paces from the front door. She didn't look at the cowboy. She didn't need to. Her hand moved to the hem of her coat, where the small embroidered cloth was folded in a secret pocket. She didn't take it out, just touched it briefly. Then she stepped forward and opened the door. Inside, dust greeted her like an old friend. The air was thick with the smell of wood rot and mice nests, but beneath that, something else. Soap, the faint scent of lavender. She moved across the floor, her boots stirring up motes that danced in the beams of afternoon light. In the far corner of the room stood a chair. Its back was broken, but it sat upright, stubborn against time. She touched it. Her fingers trembled. On the wall above the hearth hung a framed photograph. The glass was cracked. Behind it, faded by sunlight and time, was the image of a man in a deputy's badge and a girl, young, thin, wide-eyed, not smiling, just standing beside him like furniture. She stared at it for a long time, her mouth a straight line, her breath shallow. Outside, the cowboy stood with his back to the trees. He didn't look at the cabin. He looked at the horizon, where the hills met the sky in a thin gray seam. He knew what this place was, not because he'd seen it before, but because he'd seen others like it. Places where pain was folded into the walls, layered into the floorboards, buried beneath the foundation like secrets no one wanted to dig up again. She emerged just before sunset. Her face had changed, not softened but resolved. In her hand, she held the photograph. She didn't show it to him. She just stood beside him, the wind playing with the ends of her hair. Together, they turned and walked toward the horses. They didn't ride. Not yet. Not until she said what came next. But he knew it was coming. Something about blood and silence. About fathers and cages. About why she could never forget that voice behind the badge that had called her by her name and locked the door anyway. And now she was ready to open it again. But this time from the outside. The morning air settled low over the valley, still and cool, as if the land itself was waiting. Fog curled around the base of the trees and drifted through the brush like breath too tired to rise. The cowboy stirred the coals from last night's fire, adding fresh wood in silence. Sparks snapped and hissed, but the girl did not flinch. She sat wrapped in her coat, knees to her chest, eyes trained on the slope ahead, where the path rose gently toward town. A town she hadn't seen in years. A town that still held her name like a scar. They broke camp slowly, not from hesitation, but from understanding. Whatever waited ahead would not rush to meet them. It would be there whether they rode fast or walked slow. And when it came, it would come with faces she remembered and truths that couldn't be buried any deeper than they already were. The ride down was quiet. The trail narrowed, and branches brushed their shoulders like the past trying to cling to their backs. Birds began to sing again as they neared civilization, but their songs were unfamiliar, new generations, new notes. The girl noticed, but said nothing. She hadn't spoken since yesterday, not even when the cowboy handed her the reins to lead the way. They reached the edge of town by midday. It looked different, but not enough. The main street had new paint in places and some windows had been repaired, but the bones of it were the same. The sheriff's office still stood at the corner. Its sign faded, its porch tilted. The saloon had more chairs out front now. The general store had changed hands, but the bell over the door still rang the same hollow chime. No one recognized her at first. Just a girl on a horse beside a man they didn't know. But as they passed the blacksmith's shop, an old man squinting in the sun narrowed his eyes and froze. His hammer fell silent. A woman sweeping the saloon steps paused, stared, then turned away too quickly. The wind shifted. The town began to remember. They dismounted in front of the courthouse. The steps were worn smooth from boots, and the railing still bore the same initials carved into it from when she was a child. She ran her hand across them, her fingers slow, reverent. Then she climbed the steps without looking back. Inside, the clerk barely had time to speak before the door swung open and she stood in the middle of the room. The sheriff wasn't there, not yet, but his deputy was. Younger than she remembered, nervous, eyes flicking between her and the cowboy. He opened his mouth to speak, but the girl stepped forward and laid something on the desk. A folded cloth, embroidered with a single red letter, S. The deputy froze. He knew what it meant, who it had belonged to, what it implied. But before he could move, the door behind the desk creaked open, and the sheriff stepped out. He was older, grayer, thicker around the middle, but his eyes, those hadn't changed. Cold, calculating, and for a moment they didn't recognize her. For a moment, he saw only a stranger, a girl with posture too still and eyes too knowing. Then recognition hit. His face didn't twist. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't run. He simply exhaled, long and low, and said her name. Her real name, the one he'd whispered through gritted teeth before locking her away. The one she'd forced herself to forget, just to survive. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward and took out the photograph. The one from the cabin. The one with him beside her, hand on her shoulder, badge gleaming like a lie. She placed it beside the cloth. The room was silent. The cowboy stood behind her, not moving, not speaking. His presence alone was enough. A witness, a shadow, a reminder that she had not returned alone. The deputy took a step back. The sheriff stayed still. She opened her coat, slowly, and drew out one final object. The button. The one from the floorboards. The one missing from the shirt he'd worn the day it all changed. She set it on the table beside the others. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but with a voice that cut through the dust and the years and the rot. She spoke of the cellar, of the cage, of nights without light and meals slipped through cracks and screams no one came to silence. She spoke of the bribes, of the lies, of the men who looked away and the women who whispered but never acted. She named names. She gave dates. And she did not cry. The sheriff didn't speak again. The deputy was pale. A woman from outside had stepped in, hand over her mouth, listening. And slowly, others gathered. They didn't mean to, but the truth has a gravity of its own. By sundown, the sheriff was behind the same bars she had once been locked behind. But she didn't watch him sit in that cell. She didn't need to. She walked out the front door and back into the dying light. The cowboy followed, silent, his hat pulled low. They rode out of town before nightfall. Not in a hurry, not running, just moving forward. The wind picked up behind them, carrying the scent of justice, long delayed. And somewhere deep in the valley behind, a cage stood empty. Not because it had been forgotten, but because someone had returned to unlock it. Not with a key, but with truth.